Some lessons are not taught in classrooms. They are taught at dinner tables, in silences, in the way anger appears without warning, in the way love feels unsafe, in the way success feels like betrayal. You may believe your struggles are personal, your fear, your patterns, your self-doubt, but many of them did not begin with you. They were inherited, not through DNA alone, but through unspoken rules, emotional wounds, and unfinished pain passed quietly from one generation to the next. What one generation refuses to face, the next is forced to carry. And what remains unconscious does not disappear, it repeats. Today, we explore a difficult but liberating truth. Some lessons travel through bloodlines until someone becomes conscious enough to end them. That someone can be you. Pain that is not understood does not dissolve with time. It merely alters its disguise. What is avoided by one generation quietly enters the next, not as memory, but as mood, reflex, and fate. A wound that is never spoken does not remain silent. It learns to speak through behavior. It moves from event to emotion, from emotion to habit, from habit to identity. In this way, suffering becomes invisible yet powerful, shaping lives that never consented to carry it. Consider a man who grows up in scarcity, where hunger was not only physical but existential. The world taught him early that safety is fragile and loss is always near. To survive, he learned control. He hardened himself against uncertainty, measured love in discipline, and equated emotional distance with strength. His rigidity was not cruelty, it was adaptation. Yet what once saved him now becomes the language he passes on. His children do not inherit the poverty, but they inherit the tension it created. They grow up sensing that affection must be earned, that mistakes threaten belonging, that vulnerability invites danger. Love becomes conditional, approval scarce, and silence heavy with meaning. These children, now adults, may vow never to repeat what they endured. And yet, without understanding its origin, they find themselves anxious, compliant, chronically alert to disappointment. They become experts at reading moods, anticipating needs, minimizing themselves to maintain harmony. They feel an unnamed pressure to perform, to prove, to stay safe by staying small. The original trauma has migrated not as memory but as fear, not as story but as nervous system. Psychology has begun to give language to this ancient truth. Research on intergenerational trauma shows that unresolved stress can influence emotional regulation, attachment patterns, and even physiological responses to threat. But long before laboratories confirmed it, the psyche already knew. The body remembers what the conscious mind was never allowed to know. Muscles hold what words could not carry. Anxiety appears without a clear cause. Sadness arrives without a visible source. A person may look at their life and find no obvious reason for their heaviness, yet feel burdened all the same. This is not weakness. It is inheritance. What is most dangerous about unconscious pain is not its intensity, but its invisibility. When suffering is unnamed, it feels personal. One believes something is wrong with me, rather than recognizing something unfinished is moving through me. This misunderstanding turns inherited pain into self-blame. A person fights themselves for feelings that were never chosen. They attempt to discipline away anxiety, silence grief, outwork emptiness. But repression does not heal, it only buries the message deeper, where it waits for another opportunity to emerge. Pain seeks resolution, not destruction. If it cannot be met with understanding, it will express itself through repetition. The psyche repeats not because it enjoys suffering, but because it longs for consciousness. A pattern that keeps returning is not a punishment. It is a question being asked again and again. Until it is answered, it will not leave. This is why time alone does not heal. Time only deepens what remains unconscious. Generations pass, circumstances change, but the emotional equation stays the same. The setting improves, yet the inner atmosphere remains unchanged. A child may grow up in comfort, opportunity, and security, yet feel a constant sense of threat inside. The external world contradicts the internal one, and the individual cannot explain the dissonance. They search for causes in the present, unaware that the source lies behind them. To make pain conscious is not to relive it dramatically, nor to assign blame backward. It is simply to see clearly, to recognize that what lives inside you may not have begun with you. This recognition alone begins to interrupt the migration. When pain is seen, it no longer needs to travel disguised as behavior. When it is named, it loses its compulsive force. Awareness does not erase history, but it changes its direction. The moment an individual realizes that their fear is older than their own life, something loosens. Compassion replaces self-judgment. Curiosity replaces resistance. One stops asking, "Why am I like this?" and begins asking, "What am I carrying?" In that shift, the psyche begins its work. Until pain is made conscious, it continues its journey, moving silently from body to body, life to life, asking to be known. When it finally is, the journey pauses, not because the past disappears, but because it has at last been recognized. And what is recognized no longer needs to repeat itself blindly through another generation. Every family, whether it knows it or not, lives under a set of invisible laws. These laws are not written, not announced, and rarely questioned, yet they govern behavior with greater authority than any spoken rule. They are learned not through instruction, but through atmosphere. A child absorbs them the way one absorbs a climate, through tone, reaction, silence, and repetition. Long before the child can think critically, these laws have already taken residence in the psyche. Do not talk about emotions. This rule is never explained, yet it is enforced the moment tears are met with discomfort, or anger is dismissed as weakness. The child learns that feelings disturb order. Do not question authority. This lesson arrives each time curiosity is labeled disrespect. Do not outshine your elders. This law is felt when success is met with envy rather than pride. Love means sacrifice. This belief forms when care is given at the cost of self-erasure. Strength means silence. This rule settles in when endurance is praised but expression is shamed. None of these messages are necessarily spoken, yet they shape a life. The child does not consciously memorize them, the child becomes them. What cannot be expressed outwardly is driven inward, where it becomes character. Over time, obedience to these rules feels like morality, and deviation from them feels like guilt. A child who learns that expressing emotion leads to embarrassment or rejection does not stop feeling. The feelings do not disappear. They retreat. They go underground where they wait. As the child grows into adulthood, they may appear remarkably capable, reliable, disciplined, composed. They may succeed professionally, maintain order, and be admired for their strength. Yet beneath this exterior, there is often a quiet disconnection, a sense of numbness, a chronic restlessness that no achievement seems to resolve. They may feel as though life is being lived at a distance, as if something essential is missing but unnamed. This inner emptiness is often mistaken for personal failure. The individual believes they are deficient in joy, gratitude, or presence. But this is not a flaw of character. It is fidelity. It is loyalty to a system that taught them long ago that feeling fully was dangerous. The psyche would rather suffer than betray what once ensured belonging. And so, many people choose suffering over freedom, not consciously, but instinctively, because freedom feels like disloyalty to the family story. To question these silent rules feels risky. The nervous system reacts as if exile were imminent. Even when the family is no longer present, the internalized law remains. One may feel shame for resting, guilt for speaking honestly, anxiety for choosing differently. The past exerts its power not through memory, but through morality. What was once adaptation becomes identity. Yet these rules are not truths, they are strategies. They were formed in response to particular conditions, often under pressure, scarcity, or fear. What protected one generation may imprison the next. The tragedy is not that these rules exist, but that they are rarely examined. When they remain unconscious, they masquerade as reality itself. Awareness is the beginning of liberation. The moment a person recognizes, this rule is not universal, it is inherited, a small but profound shift occurs. The rule loses its absolute authority. It can be observed rather than obeyed blindly. One may still feel the pull of old loyalty, but it no longer dictates every choice. The the psyche gains space. To see the rule does not mean to reject one's family or deny its love. It means to differentiate, to understand that belonging does not require self-abandonment, that respect does not demand silence, that love does not have to be earned through suffering. This realization is often accompanied by grief, the grief of what was not allowed, not spoken, not lived. But grief is movement, and movement is life. Once the invisible law is made visible, it can no longer operate in the shadows. It may still whisper, but it no longer commands. The individual begins to choose consciously rather than react automatically. Expression becomes possible. Authority can be questioned internally. Success no longer feels like betrayal. Strength expands to include vulnerability. In this way, awareness does not destroy the family story, it matures it. What was once rigid becomes flexible. What was once compulsory becomes optional. And the individual, no longer fully ruled by inherited laws, begins to live not against their history, but beyond it. Human life is not as random as it appears. Beneath the surface of daily events, there is a quiet order at work, one that reveals itself through repetition. What returns again and again is never accidental. Patterns are not punishments imposed from the outside. They are messages rising from within. They are the psyche's chosen language when it has been ignored too long. What we refuse to confront does not retreat. It reorganizes itself and waits for another chance to be seen. Consider how often the same story appears wearing different faces. A relationship ends in abandonment, and later another follows the same path. Financial stability seems within reach, yet collapse arrives at the familiar moment. Anger erupts precisely when calm was promised, as if some inner force had taken control. These recurrences are usually met with frustration and self-judgment. One believes they are unlucky, weak, or flawed. But repetition is not evidence of failure. It is evidence of meaning. The psyche repeats what has not yet been understood. We often approach healing with the idea of elimination. We want to remove anxiety, erase anger, silence fear, and dismantle patterns as if they were mechanical faults. But the psyche does not work like a machine. It works like a story seeking completion. When we attempt to destroy a pattern without understanding its purpose, we only drive it deeper into the unconscious, where it gains strength and returns in a more disruptive form. To listen to a pattern is a different act entirely. Listening requires humility. It asks us to suspend the question, "What is wrong with me?" and replace it with a more difficult one, "What is trying to be known through me?" This shift transforms the problem from a personal defect into a psychological inheritance. Suddenly, the pattern is not an enemy, but a messenger carrying unfinished business. Take the man who grew up watching his father suppress anger. The household may have been quiet, orderly, and controlled, but beneath the calm was a constant tension. Rage was never expressed, never explored, never given language. The child learned that anger was dangerous, shameful, or unacceptable. As an adult, he may vow never to become like his father. He prides himself on restraint, composure, and rationality. And yet, when the pressure builds beyond a certain point, anger bursts forth unpredictably, often in moments of intimacy or vulnerability. He is bewildered by his own behavior, ashamed of his outbursts, and determined to suppress them further. But the anger does not belong solely to him. It is borrowed emotion, inherited through silence. Because it was never integrated, it remains primitive and explosive. Suppression does not civilize emotion, it infantilizes it. What is denied remains stuck at the stage at which it was forbidden. The psyche does not forget what the conscious mind avoids. It stores it, waiting for a moment when expression becomes unavoidable. This is why moral effort alone rarely breaks patterns. Willpower cannot integrate what understanding has not touched. A person can promise endlessly to change, yet the pattern persists because the underlying story has not been heard. The psyche does not respond to commands, it responds to recognition. To confront a pattern is not to indulge it, nor to justify harmful behavior. It is to bring it into relationship with consciousness. When an emotion, impulse, or fear is allowed to speak without judgment, without panic, it begins to transform. Understanding introduces differentiation. The individual can say, "This feeling is in me, but it is not all of me." In that distinction, choice becomes possible. What is denied seeks expression, often in distorted and destructive ways. But what is understood begins to loosen its grip. Awareness does not instantly dissolve repetition, but it weakens its compulsive force. The pattern no longer needs to shout to be heard. It no longer needs to reenact itself in the external world, because it has finally been welcomed into the inner one. Every repeated struggle carries within it the possibility of insight. The psyche is not trying to sabotage you. It is trying to complete something that was interrupted long ago. When you stop fighting the pattern and begin listening to it, you discover that it is not asking to dominate your life, but to be acknowledged within it. And in that moment of acknowledgement, the repetition begins to lose its necessity, and the individual takes the first step out of unconscious fate and into conscious life. To interrupt a generational pattern does not require anger toward the past, nor condemnation of those who came before. Blame binds us to what we wish to escape. Clarity, however, loosens the knot. To see clearly is to recognize that much of what lives inside us was shaped under conditions we did not choose. This recognition does not weaken responsibility, it deepens it. For when something becomes conscious, it becomes our task. Within every family system, there comes a moment when one individual is called into a different role. Not appointed, not celebrated, often not even understood. This role is not one of rebellion, but of awareness. It is the role of the one who feels what others could not afford to feel, the one who senses the weight beneath the surface and refuses to move blindly under it. This is not an easy position. It requires standing at the edge of the familiar and tolerating the discomfort of seeing what has long been avoided. To feel what others avoided means allowing grief where there was denial, anger where there was silence, fear where there was bravado. It means staying present with emotions that previous generations had to suppress in order to survive. Survival demanded efficiency, not reflection. But what ensured survival does not always allow wholeness. The individual who becomes conscious often carries not only their own emotions, but the unexpressed emotions of those who came before. This can feel overwhelming, as though one life were carrying many. The instinctive response to inherited emotion is reaction. Families develop predictable rhythms, a raised voice triggers withdrawal. Disagreement invites punishment, vulnerability meets discomfort. To pause instead of react is to step out of the inherited script. That pause may last only a moment, but within it lies choice. Reaction is the past repeating itself automatically. Pause is the present making space for something new. To name a pattern rather than obey it is a radical act. Patterns draw their power from invisibility. When they are named, they lose their absolute authority. To say, even silently, "This is not just my feeling, this is a familiar pattern," introduces distance. In that distance, the psyche can breathe. One is no longer possessed by the pattern, but in dialogue with it. Naming does not destroy loyalty, it refines it. It separates love from unconscious repetition. Choosing awareness over automatic loyalty is perhaps the most painful step. Loyalty to a family is rarely rational, it is visceral. It lives in the body as tension, guilt, and fear of exclusion. To act differently can feel like betrayal, even when the old pattern causes suffering. Many people would rather remain unhappy than risk separation. The unconscious equation is simple: belonging equals survival. Awareness threatens this equation by suggesting that one can belong to oneself as well. This path often brings loneliness. The one who interrupts the cycle may feel isolated, misunderstood, or accused of being difficult, cold, or disloyal. Families rarely applaud the individual who disrupts familiar dynamics. Change exposes what was hidden, and what was hidden often prefers to remain so. Resistance is not evidence of wrongdoing, it is evidence of impact. When a system reacts strongly, it is because something fundamental is shifting. Psychologically, this is how evolution occurs. not through the slow change of bodies, but through the transformation of consciousness. Emotional evolution happens when an individual can hold complexity where simplicity once ruled. When one can love without repeating harm, feel without collapsing, see without condemning. Each time this occurs, the family story subtly changes. The past does not disappear, but it no longer dictates the future. It is tempting to fight the past, to declare independence through rejection, but opposition keeps the old story alive in reverse. True healing is quieter. It is the steady act of understanding. When one sees clearly, the past no longer needs to announce itself through repetition. It has been recognized. It has been included. It can rest. To become conscious is not to become perfect. Old reactions may still arise. Familiar emotions may still appear. But they are met differently. They are no longer unquestioned commands, but signals. In that shift, the bloodline loop weakens. What once moved blindly through generations encounters awareness and slows. You do not heal what came before by erasing it. You heal it by carrying it differently. When consciousness enters where compulsion once ruled, the psyche is freed from the necessity of repetition. The story does not end in conflict, but in understanding. And in that understanding, something long trapped in motion finally comes to rest. There comes a moment in inner development when a quiet but profound realization emerges. Not everything you carry belongs to you. Much of what weighs upon the soul arrived long before your first breath, shaped by lives lived under pressures you never knew, fears you never chose, and conditions that demanded endurance rather than reflection. To recognize this is not to diminish your ancestors, but to see them clearly as human beings who adapted as best they could to the demands of their time. What they endured shaped what they passed on, often unconsciously, and what you received was not only their strength, but also their unfinished burdens. To honor those who came before does not require the repetition of their wounds. Respect does not mean imitation. Gratitude does not demand self-sacrifice in the same form. A family may have survived through silence, suspicion, or relentless self-denial. Those strategies may have been necessary once. But necessity does not make them eternal truths. When circumstances change, the psyche must also change, or it will continue to live as though danger were still present. Many people remain internally at war long after the battlefield has disappeared. It is possible to feel deep love for one's family while refusing to reenact its pain. This refusal is often misunderstood. It can look like distance, coldness, or rebellion. In reality, it is differentiation. It is the act of becoming a person rather than a pattern. When an individual begins to separate what is truly theirs from what was inherited, a subtle but powerful shift occurs. Guilt loosens its grip. The constant sense of obligation begins to soften. One realizes that carrying another's fear does not heal it. It only extends its lifespan. Ending a generational lesson does not mean erasing history or denying suffering. History cannot be undone, and suffering should not be dismissed. Transformation does not occur through forgetting, but through integration. What is integrated no longer needs to be acted out. When pain is understood in its proper context, it loses its authority over the present. The past becomes a source of insight rather than a script demanding reenactment. The psyche is not confined to linear time. When awareness arises in the present, it reaches both backward and forward. An individual who becomes conscious of inherited patterns does not only change their own life, they alter the emotional atmosphere of the lineage itself. Children sense what has shifted even when nothing is spoken. They grow up in a field where certain fears are no longer dominant, certain silence is no longer mandatory. In this way, one person's awareness becomes a gift to those who come after, even if it was never received by those who came before. This role is often misunderstood as grand or heroic. In truth, it is quiet and ordinary. It does not require perfection. It does not require saving anyone. The desire to rescue others is often another inherited burden, born from the belief that one's worth lies in self-erasure. True change begins when that belief is questioned. You are not responsible for repairing every wound in your family tree. You are responsible for not passing them on unconsciously. There is a particular humility in this realization. One stops striving to be exceptional and begins striving to be honest. Old emotions still arise, familiar reactions still surface, but they are met with awareness rather than identification. One can say, "This fear is present, but it is not my identity." In that distinction, freedom appears not as rebellion, but as quiet choice. To say, "This ends with me," is not an act of defiance. It is an act of compassion. It acknowledges the suffering of the past without allowing it to dictate the future. It recognizes that strength does not lie in endless endurance, but in the courage to change direction. This courage is rarely dramatic. It shows itself in small moments, choosing to speak rather than remain silent, resting without guilt, allowing joy without suspicion, setting boundaries without apology. Such choices may feel insignificant, but psychologically they are profound. They signal to the psyche that the conditions have changed, that survival no longer requires the same strategies, that life can be lived rather than merely endured. Over time, these choices accumulate, and what once felt inevitable begins to loosen. You are not here to be the final expression of inherited pain. You are here to be its turning point. Not through force, but through understanding. Not through perfection, but through presence. When you recognize that some burdens were never yours to carry, you lay them down, not in rejection of the past, but in service to life itself. And in that quiet act, something ancient finally comes to rest, no longer needing to move forward through you. You are not weak for feeling deeply. You are not broken for struggling. You may simply be the first in your bloodline willing to see clearly. Some lessons travel through generations until someone has the courage to stop carrying them. If you are listening to this and feel unsettled, if something inside you feels recognized, that is not coincidence. That is consciousness knocking, asking to be welcomed. And once welcomed, the cycle can finally rest.